Max Caulfield is not a time traveler. Daniel Diaz is not a telekinetic. Rachel Amber is not a pyrokinetic. And Alex Chen both is and isn't an empath. Welcome to part 3 of my series, Life is Strange Powers Aren't What You Think They Are. Today we will be covering Life is Strange 2 character Daniel Diaz, who seems to move objects around with his mind, who I maintain is not a telekinetic. Now, like anyone with telekinetic abilities, mass is no object. I hate puns, that was not intentional. By chapter 3, he's lifting several 100-pound tree trunks out of lakes with no effort. The interesting thing that I note about the way that he lifts objects, small or large, is that there isn't a single point of pickup, that they all seem to move with steady evenness, and that the second thing is that there is no differentiation in speed. There is no real acceleration to it. He will look at an object and it will go there. It won't teeter, it won't wobble. If he wants it to move in a pattern, it will move in a pattern. One thing I do note that is very interesting is that the wind is always moving in these moments. There's some kind of air displacement going on around 99% of the objects that he is moving in the game, particularly when there are multiple objects or they are very large. With all of this information, I have come to the conclusion that Daniel Diaz both has a limit on his power, but also has a somewhat limitless power. On the one hand, he clearly has an acceleration limit, right? Which limits the amount of force that he can put into any thrown object. He can increase the damage done simply by virtue of its mass, but unfortunately, without him being able to accelerate it past whatever that cap is that he seems to have, that puts a steady ceiling on whatever he can throw. Now me, I think a telekinetic, if they had complete control over an object by their own will, then they should be able to throw it at any speed they wanted. Because physics be damned at that point, you should be able to chuck that sucker. However, if the object were sort of operating under its own imperative and not someone else's, well, then it would have a finite or even speed now, wouldn't it? And this brings us to what Daniel Diaz is actually doing. Daniel Diaz is not moving objects with his mind. Daniel Diaz commands objects to move because he has control over all three-dimensional matter as a fourth-dimensional being. What really sells me on this is the way the air moves, because air, despite it being, ephemeral, does have mass and is matter. And when Daniel commands an object to move, oftentimes there is a forceful bit of air in the area around that object because it too must move as commanded. A telekinetic would have the precision to move the object and only the object. The reason we see the wind is because he cannot be precise, he is just commanding the mass in a certain area to move. But in launching them, it's not like he's hitting them in any particular direction. They're just forced to move in that direction because they've been commanded to do so. If you're having trouble picturing this or a little confused, we are three-dimensional beings. If we draw something on a piece of paper, we have complete control over everything on that piece of paper. It is two-dimensional and we are in control. Meanwhile, nothing on that two-dimensional thing, that piece of paper, is able to interact with us. We exist in another dimension above it. And as long as we do not end up traveling in their two-dimensional space, then they have no ability to affect us. But we, however, can affect them from outside their realm. Confused yet? It doesn't get easier. Now, because of the nature of the fourth dimension versus the difference between the second and third dimension, the difference between the third and the fourth, a fourth-dimensional being still does, for the most part, travel through three-dimensional space, and therefore, three-dimensional beings are capable of interacting with a fourth-dimensional being to an extent. But in the same way that I exert no effort to create a triangle on a piece of paper, would a fourth-dimensional being be able to move a three-dimensional human being 80 feet directly up into the air? Now, some of you might be thinking this feels like a bit of a quibble, like I'm splitting hairs, and I'll cede to a point on that. I will say this. There is something in other Life is Strange lore, or things that I believe, that makes me think fourth-dimensional being makes the most sense in this explanation. And if that has your interest, you definitely are going to want to stick around for the next one when we finally break down Max Caulfield, and you'll get your question answered then.